While you're cranking your thermostat to 72 degrees and watching your heating bill skyrocket, Native Americans were staying toasty warm in thin-walled teepees during brutal winters that could kill. No electricity, no gas, no modern insulation. Yet somehow, they were more comfortable than you are right now in your expensive, heated home. Living in a teepee during harsh winter months sounds like a recipe for frostbite and misery. Most people assume these cone-shaped shelters were flimsy summer tents that left Native Americans shivering through brutal cold snaps. Wrong. Dead wrong, actually. The teepee represents one of humanity's most ingenious heating systems, engineered through centuries of trial and frozen error. These weren't primitive huts. They were sophisticated thermal machines that could maintain comfortable temperatures even when outside air dropped to bone-cracking cold. But here's where it gets interesting. The secret wasn't just throwing more wood on a fire and hoping for the best. Native American tribes developed a complex system of heat management that would make modern engineers jealous. They understood principles of thermodynamics, air circulation, and insulation that took European settlers decades to figure out. Take the Lakota, for instance. They could keep a family of 6 warm and cozy in sub-zero temperatures using less fuel than most people burn in their fireplaces during a single evening. How? They mastered the art of capturing, redirecting, and storing heat in ways that maximized every BTU. The whole setup worked like a carefully orchestrated symphony. Every component, from the fire placement to the sleeping arrangements, served multiple heating purposes. Nothing was wasted. Every design choice had thermal reasoning behind it. Well, except for one small problem. Most of these techniques have been forgotten or misunderstood by modern campers who try to recreate tipi living. They build their fires too big, place their shelters in the wrong spots, and wonder why they're burning through firewood while still freezing their backsides off. The real genius lay in understanding that effective winter heating isn't about generating maximum heat. It's about managing heat flow. Native Americans treated their tipis like living, breathing organisms that needed proper feeding, ventilation, and care to function optimally. Then there's the fact that these families often stayed warmer in their teepees than many people do in their modern homes today. They accomplished this without central heating, without electricity, and without running to the hardware store for emergency space heaters. The techniques they developed were so effective that some winter camping enthusiasts and survival experts still use modified versions today. But to understand how they pulled off this thermal magic trick, you need to start with the most obvious element, yet the one that's most commonly done wrong. The genius wasn't just in the tipi's cone shape, it was in creating a complete heating system that would make modern engineers jealous. At the heart of everything sat a small, carefully controlled fire that burned inside the teepee, with smoke escaping through adjustable flaps at the very top. These weren't random holes in the hide. The smoke flaps could be aimed using long poles, letting people control the draft and wind like adjusting a thermostat. When winter storms hit from the north, they'd shift the flaps to keep smoke flowing out while preventing downdrafts that could fill the space with choking fumes. A ring of stones surrounded the fire, containing embers and radiating steady heat long after flames died down. The trick was keeping the fire low and steady. Big blazes would scorch the hide cover and waste precious fuel. Instead, small flames provided consistent warmth without the drama. But here's where it gets really clever. Native Americans hung an inner liner inside the teepee that created what we now call a thermal envelope. Cold air entered at ground level, traveled up behind this liner, and fed oxygen to the fire. Meanwhile, the warm air stayed trapped in the lower area where people actually lived and slept. Brilliant, right? The smoke hole flaps needed daily adjustment based on wind direction, a job that required reading weather patterns like a meteorologist. Well, maybe better than most meteorologists. An additional ceiling panel called an ozone hung over the sleeping area, creating a heat trap that kept the warmest air right where bodies needed it most. Ground insulation was just as critical as air management. Thick buffalo robes and woven mats created barriers against the frozen earth below. Many families built raised sleeping platforms that lifted bodies completely off the cold ground. Essentially, the world's first heated floors. During the day, the packed earth floor absorbed heat from the fire and sun. At night, it slowly released that stored warmth back into the living space, Some groups even buried heated river stones under their bedding or wrapped hot rocks in hide to create personal heating pads that stayed warm for hours. The whole system worked because every element supported the others. Fire warmed air, liners directed airflow, ground insulation prevented heat loss, and thermal mass stored energy for later release. Of course, none of this mattered if you didn't have the right materials and setup techniques, which brings us to the next crucial piece of the puzzle. The secret to staying warm in a teepee wasn't just throwing logs on a fire and hoping for the best. Native Americans had figured out something most people today still don't understand. Controlling airflow could make the difference between freezing and staying cozy all night long. Here's where it gets clever. They hung an inner liner inside the teepee that created what engineers today would call a thermal barrier system. Cold air would sneak in under the outer cover, travel up behind this liner, and feed oxygen directly to the fire. Meanwhile, the warm air stayed trapped in the lower area where people actually lived and slept. Brilliant, right? But the real genius was in those smoke hole flaps at the top. Every single day, someone had to adjust these flaps based on wind direction using long poles. Get it wrong, and smoke would pour back into the living space. Get it right, and you'd have a perfect draft that pulled smoke out while keeping heat in. The Lakota had specific terms for different wind patterns and exactly how to position those flaps for each one. Then there's the ozone, a partial ceiling panel that hung inside like a heat trap. This thing caught all the rising warm air and reflected it back down to where people were sleeping. Modern campers would kill for this kind of built-in heat distribution system. Ground insulation was just as important as what happened overhead. Thick buffalo robes and woven mats created a barrier between bodies and the frozen earth. Some families built raised sleeping platforms, basically wooden frames that lifted bedding completely off the ground. Well, others packed dirt floors so tight they'd absorb heat during the day and slowly release it through the night. The really smart move was using heated stones and carefully managed coals. River rocks would get heated in the fire, wrapped in hide, and tucked under bedding like ancient hot water bottles. Coals got banked with ash to keep them alive until morning. No matches back then meant keeping some fire going was literally a matter of survival. Multiple small fires worked better than one big blaze. Less smoke, better heat control, and way less fuel consumption. Makes sense when you're living through a Dakota winter with limited wood supplies. Of course, staying warm wasn't just about the fire itself. The real magic happened when all these heating methods worked together with smart material choices and sleeping strategies. Ever wonder why Native Americans weren't just burning down their teepees every night? The secret was in the fire itself. Small, controlled flames burned in the center, creating a heat source that warmed without turning your shelter into a smoke-filled disaster. The fire sat inside a careful ring of stones. These weren't just any rocks. River stones worked best because they held heat without cracking. The stone ring kept embers contained and created a thermal battery that radiated warmth long after the flames died down. Smart positioning was everything. Too big a fire and you'd scorch the hide cover. Too small and you'd freeze. Here's where it gets clever. Those triangular smoke flaps at the top weren't just for show. Two long poles adjusted these flaps like giant tweezers, directing them based on wind direction. When positioned correctly, they created a natural draft that pulled smoke up and out while drawing fresh air in from the bottom. Daily wind changes meant constant adjustments, but this system worked like a prehistoric chimney. The real genius was multitasking the heat source. Cooking fires doubled as room heaters during brutal winter nights. Women prepared meals while the same flames warmed the entire family space. No separate heating system needed. Just one efficient fire doing double duty. But wait, there's more to this heating puzzle. That inner liner hanging inside the teepee, it created something called a thermal envelope. Cold air entered under the bottom edge of the outer cover, traveled up behind this liner, and fed oxygen to the fire. Meanwhile, warm air stayed trapped in the lower living space where people actually sat and slept. The ozone deserves special mention. This partial ceiling panel hung overhead like a heat reflector, trapping rising warmth and bouncing it back down to the sleeping area. Think of it as a primitive heat exchanger that kept the good stuff where you needed it most. Fire management required constant attention. Flames stayed low and steady rather than roaring high. This prevented dangerous flare-ups while maximizing heat output per stick of fuel. The whole system worked because every element, stone ring, smoke flaps, inner liner, and careful fire tending, worked together. Yet even the most perfect fire meant nothing without proper insulation underneath. The ground could steal your body heat faster than any winter wind, which brings us to the next crucial layer of tipi warmth. Here's the thing about staying warm in a teepee. Everything starts with the fire, but not the way you'd expect. Most people think bigger flames equal more heat. Wrong. The secret was keeping a small, steady fire burning right in the center, with flames barely reaching knee height. Too big and you'd scorch the hide walls. Too small and you'd freeze. The real genius was in the smoke management. Those triangular flaps at the top, they weren't just decoration. Native families adjusted them with long poles every single time the wind shifted, creating a perfect draft that pulled smoke up and out while drawing fresh air in from the bottom. Makes sense, right? But here's where it gets clever. They position the flaps like airplane wings, using wind direction to actually improve the draw. A ring of stones surrounded every fire, but not for the reason you'd think. Sure, it contained the flames, but those rocks became heat batteries. They'd absorb warmth all day and radiate it back for hours after the fire died down. Some families even heated extra river stones in the flames, then wrapped them in hide to use as personal bed warmers. Then there's the fuel strategy that saved lives. Dry hardwood burned long and steady, perfect for overnight coals. Softwood gave quick bursts of heat for morning warm-ups. When wood ran scarce, dried buffalo dung burned surprisingly well, producing steady heat with minimal smoke. The trick was keeping fires small and hot rather than large and smoky. But the weird part is how they managed overnight heating. Families banked their coals with ash before sleeping, which kept embers alive until dawn without constant tending. Someone always took the night watch, adding thin sticks slowly to avoid sudden flare-ups that could wake everyone or create dangerous sparks. Fire carriers, usually made from punkwood or dried fungus, let them transport live embers between camps safely. This meant never starting from scratch, which could mean the difference between warmth and hypothermia on brutal winter nights. The cooking fire pulled double duty too. Every meal preparation added ambient heat to the living space. Hot soups and rendered fats didn't just fill stomachs, they boosted internal body temperature from within. Well, having a perfect fire meant nothing without proper airflow control, which brings us to one of the most brilliant heating innovations ever developed. The flickering glow at the center of every tipi wasn't just for show. That small, carefully managed fire served as the entire heating system, cooking station, and social hub all rolled into one. But here's what most people miss. These weren't roaring bonfires. We're talking about controlled, almost delicate flames that required serious skill to maintain. The fire sat inside a ring of river stones, and those rocks weren't decoration. They absorbed heat during the day and slowly released it back into the space for hours after the flames died down. Smart, right? The stones also kept burning embers from rolling across the floor and turning your home into a bonfire. Those smoke flaps at the top, they moved constantly. Native Americans adjusted them with long poles throughout the day, reading wind direction, like weather forecasters. When positioned correctly, the flaps created a natural draft that pulled smoke up and out while drawing fresh air in from the bottom. Get it wrong, and you'd smoke yourself out of your own shelter. Then there's the genius part most people never hear about. The fire burned low and steady. Think campfire embers rather than 4th of July bonfire. Low flames meant less fuel consumption, less smoke, and gentler heat that warmed people without scorching the hide walls. During winter nights, cooking fires doubled as room heaters, making every meal preparation a heating session. But managing that fire took real expertise. Too much wood and you'd create a smoke problem that could suffocate everyone inside. Too little and you'd freeze before morning. The trick was maintaining just enough flame to keep warm air circulating while banking coals with ash to preserve heat overnight. Fire tending became a community responsibility. Someone always stayed awake during the coldest nights, adding small sticks every few hours to keep the warmth going. They used thin kindling for quick heat bursts and thicker logs for steady overnight coals. When wood ran scarce, dried buffalo dung became the fuel of choice. It burned surprisingly well and produced steady, smokeless heat. The real magic happened when everything worked together. That carefully controlled fire, combined with proper ventilation and stone heat storage, could keep a teepee warm even when temperatures outside dropped below freezing. Well, the fire was just one piece of the puzzle. The way air moved through these shelters involved engineering tricks that would make modern architects jealous. Controlling fire inside a teepee wasn't just about lighting wood and hoping for the best. These people had turned heat management into pure science, and their techniques would make modern campers weep with envy. The fire ring sat dead center, made from carefully chosen stones that could handle extreme temperature swings without exploding. Yes, exploding. River rocks were avoided because trapped moisture could turn them into grenades when heated. The flames stayed low and steady, never roaring like a bonfire. Why? Because scorching your ceiling meant disaster and wasting precious fuel meant freezing. But here's where things get brilliant. Those smoke flaps at the top weren't just holes with covers. They were adjustable vents controlled by long poles, repositioned constantly based on wind direction. On windy days, families adjusted these flaps multiple times, creating the perfect draft to pull smoke up and out while keeping warmth in. Then there's the genius of the inner liner system. Picture a tent within a tent, but smarter. Cold air entered at ground level, traveled up behind the liner, and fed oxygen to the fire. Meanwhile, warm air stayed trapped in the lower living space where people actually sat and slept. The result? Perfect air circulation that would make HVAC engineers jealous. The ozone ceiling panel deserves special mention. This angled piece of hide hung above the sleeping area, trapping rising heat and directing it down where bodies needed warmth most. Smoke still escaped, but precious heat got recycled. Fire tending became an art form. Coals were banked with ash each night, keeping embers alive until morning without wasting fuel. Hot river stones, heated in the flames, got wrapped in hide and used as portable heaters. Some families buried heated rocks under sleeping areas, creating radiant floor heating that lasted hours. Fuel choices mattered enormously. Dry hardwoods burned longest, while softwoods provided quick heat for cooking. When wood ran scarce, dried buffalo dung became the backup fuel of choice. Burns clean, holds heat well, and there was plenty of it on the plains. The weird part is how they managed multiple small fires instead of one big blaze. Smaller fires meant better heat control, less smoke, and more efficient fuel use. Night watches kept fires going with tiny additions of kindling, avoiding dangerous flare-ups that could ignite the cover. Getting the fire right was only half the battle, though. The real magic happened when smart airflow met clever engineering tricks that most people never even noticed. Winter nights on the Great Plains could drop to 30 below zero. Death came fast if you weren't smart about fuel. Buffalo dung became the lifeline when trees grew scarce across endless grasslands. These dried patties burned steady and clean, throwing consistent heat for hours without the smoky flare-ups that choked families inside their shelters. Prairie dwellers collected piles of these fuel disks like others stockpiled firewood. Makes sense, right? When your nearest tree sits 50 miles away, you adapt or freeze. Hardwood chunks ruled the overnight shift. Oak and ash burned slow, leaving glowing coals that lasted until dawn without constant feeding. But here's the clever part. Thin kindling strips got the fire roaring fast when temperatures plummeted suddenly. Smart fire tenders kept both sizes ready, switching between quick heat bursts and long, steady burns depending on conditions outside. The real skill showed in keeping flames small but intense. Huge bonfires ate through precious fuel in minutes while filling the space with choking smoke. Experienced families built compact fires that threw maximum heat with minimum wood consumption. These controlled burns stayed hot enough to warm bodies, but cool enough to avoid scorching the hide walls just feet away. Then there's the night watch system that kept everyone alive during blizzards. Family members took turns feeding the fire throughout the darkest hours, adding fuel piece by piece to maintain steady warmth without dangerous flare-ups. Children learned this rotation early. Your survival depended on never letting those coals die completely. Well, what happened when the main fire burned too low? Fire carriers solved this problem with portable ember containers made from hollow gourds or bark vessels. These ingenious devices moved live coals between different areas of camp or even between moving groups during winter travel. One spark could restart an entire heating system in minutes. Banking coals became an art form for extending fuel life. Families covered glowing embers with layers of ash that slowed burning while keeping the core alive for hours. This technique stretched limited wood supplies through the longest, coldest nights when gathering more fuel meant risking frostbite or worse. But smart fuel management meant nothing without understanding airflow patterns that fed those carefully tended flames. The whole heating system depended on controlling exactly how air moved through the living space, and getting that wrong could mean disaster.